program in the series, Take Back Your Country. Politicians of our country seem to have decided to plan to create a country which is backward and poorly educated. What a terrible thing to do. How terrible to dishonour those who fought for this country and died for this country, that the result would be a backward and poorly educated country. This seems to be improbable, but it is the only conclusion that we can draw from what the politicians are doing rather than saying. And remember, not so long ago, when the budget was handed down and the Treasurer delivered to the country a $1 trillion debt, a $1 trillion debt which would grow, the politicians gave him a standing ovation. Remember, too, that deficit, that enormous deficit which contributes so much to the debt, comes from a completely unnecessary series of lockdowns, first nationally and then in certain of the states. And notice too that in relation to those lockdowns, these were lockdowns of productive small business, and they exempted the non-frontline public sector, the bureaucracy and the politicians. What an extraordinary thing to do. We did reasonably well in relation to the virus. There's a complete truth in that. We didn't do as well as some other countries, but we did better than the Europeans and the North Americans. And we did so not because of the politicians, but because we are remote islands. The remote islands have a natural defense, provided that they effectively closed their borders, which we took a little long time to do and delayed some aspects of that. But it's because we are remote islands that we've done so well. Just like Fiji, except that Fiji, proportionately, has done 9 times better than Australia. And the way to measure how well a country performs is the death rate per million, and they've done so much better than we have in that regard. The problem with the politicians is that they pour money down the drain. Every year, they lose about 230 billion, according to an expert report given to the premiers. The federal politicians lose 230 billion because they try and control the areas of government policy which the Constitution reserves to the states. Education being a typical example. The founders of our country and the people intended that education be a state matter and not a federal matter. The federal government has tried to take these over, and they lose about 230 billion in duplications and all sorts of issues which come from the federal government trying to do what is reserved to the states. 230 billion, not once off, but every year, according to an expert report to the premiers. And that's only the beginning, because they go on a splurge of pouring money down the drain. Politicians do what no sensible small business person would do, no sensible farmer would do. They waste money, and they waste it constantly. The amount of money lost is far more than the 10% of GDP, the 230 billion, which has been identified merely because they refuse to accept the Constitution and the fact that the people in a series of referendums have refused to formally transfer those powers to Canberra. The politicians have 10 myths on which they're basing the mismanagement of this country, on which they will deliver a backward country, which will also be a poorly educated country. And the first myth is this. They believe that if there is any significant problem in Australia, it's best solved by Canberra adopting a uniform solution which is to be paid for by the taxpayers. And we've seen this, for example, in relation to the NSID, which was the thought bubble in the mind of the Gillard government, which the coalition took on, and which is projected within 3 years to be costing $40 billion. $40 billion, almost the same as defence for the NSID. And then there was the NBN, which should have been left to the private sector, as it has been in most Western countries, and done very well. They've done this by making it an off-budget investment. The money spent on the NBN doesn't appear in the budget, so we don't know about it in the total debt or the annual deficit. And this is to reach a situation where it will be sold off at an enormous loss, if they can get anything for it by the time it's sold off, because technology will have advanced. And there will be this enormous loss which they'll try to hide because it won't appear in the budget because it's an off-budget investment. The second myth, and I won't go through all of them, the second myth is that if you do need the private sector, involve crony capitalists, that is, capitalists close to the government, who know how to make money from government, and also involve, if you can, the power brokers who can be involved on a commission to find the purchasers. We saw a classical example of that in New South Wales a few years ago when the Western Suburbs buses were handed over without going to tender, that is, without inviting other people to be involved in it, was given to a client of a power broker known to the New South Wales government. And the third myth is that if the politicians are always wiser than you, the general public. Politicians are always wiser, they know more than you, and therefore they always come to the right decision. That's why, I suppose, they decided on that ridiculous free trade agreement with Communist China, which the Chinese have torn up and imposed all sorts of burdens on us, and which the politicians believed would be wonderful for us, so wonderful indeed that they handed over to the Communist Chinese entities, so-called companies, which act in the ultimate analysis on the instructions of the Communist Chinese Party. They handed over a swathe of premium and strategic assets to the Communist Party of China. Then a fourth myth. They claim that inflation has been conquered. It's never going to be a problem again. Those old enough to remember know what a problem it was. And we see with a similar politician in the White House that inflation in America has suddenly jumped on an annualized basis to 4.2%. 4.2% is seriously inflationary, is probably only the beginning. The fifth myth, they say, is our low rate of investment doesn't matter. It's of no importance. It's projected that this will increase to 10%. This is the rate of investment in accordance with the GDP. But this is about half of that of the successful Asian economies. This will mean, although they start lower than we are, that they will shoot ahead in time, so that the people of Singapore, the people of Malaya, the people of other Asian countries will, on a per capita basis, become wealthier than Australians, and they'll come here and young Australians will have jobs working as waiters for holidaying people from Southeast Asia, because our governments have been too inadequate in their performance to ensure that investment in Australia is higher than in Asia. The next point, the next myth they depend on is that they say the total gross domestic product is much more important than the per head or per capita gross domestic product. That is, the total is more important than when you average it out across Australians. So it doesn't matter if vastly more people are brought in and crowded into Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, because there's no development much elsewhere. It doesn't matter if that happens. It doesn't matter if the average Australian becomes poorer. It doesn't matter if young Australians are finding the housing market being priced out of them. That doesn't matter. What's important is the gross domestic product, because this will produce one favourable report on an inside page in the Wall Street Journal. And the politicians will purr, the bureaucrats will purr. It'll mean nothing to the average Australian, who will only be getting poorer and poorer. The seventh myth that the politicians have is that making more Australians dependent on government is a good thing. Having more Australians on the dole is probably a good thing, because they're then more likely to vote for the party that gives them this. So if you have more Australians dependent, not working, getting into mischief if they're young and healthy, that's a good thing. It's nothing to worry about. They should design programs which do look after the genuinely out of work, who do look after the disabled and so on, but don't create a class of people who decide that their aim in life will be to live off the government. And the politicians have only encouraged this. The eighth myth is that Acton's warning that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely is no longer relevant. And they've shown that in relation to the Wahoo or COVID-19 virus. I prefer to call it the Wahoo virus because that's where it came from. The preferred communist name for the virus is COVID-19. That was what the WHO accepted, and we obediently have followed the Communist Chinese in naming the virus the COVID-19 virus, although it is the Wahoo virus. And what's happened in relation to that is that the politicians have shown that checks and balances on power are no longer applicable. The politicians suddenly decide that there's going to be a lockdown, that we're going to wear masks on a particular occasion, or we're not going to wear masks, or that your business is going to be closed. They suddenly decide this. And this is not subject to any proper scrutiny. It's not tested because upper houses, including the Senate, have given up their power to exercise scrutiny and disallow regulations which are improper. The courts don't seem to be wanting to get involved. The checks and balances on power seem to have all disappeared. And what they're really saying is Acton's warning that power tends to corrupt no longer applies. Well, of course it does. And we shouldn't allow the checks and balances on power to be stripped away as they have. Their ninth myth are that the two principal drivers of government policy in Australia should be global warming and critical theory, critical racial theory, critical gender theory, and so on. These are two Marxist concepts. They're favoured by the Marxists, except in countries which are still run by the Marxists. They wouldn't have anything to do, seriously, with applying the rules of global warming, climate change. In the People's Republic of China, they'll say they're going to get rid of emissions, but they'll say anything, as we know, because that's the way communists behave. And they're not subject to any control. So we have these two concepts, global warming and critical theory, which are obviously designed or favoured by the Marxists, that is the communists, to weaken and bring down the West. And this is part and parcel, as I say, of a plan, you would think, because that's the result of what the politicians are doing, a plan to make us backward and poorly educated. And the tenth myth that the politicians have is that they are more able to prioritize problems than the rest of us, because they're better informed, they're probably more intelligent, they think, than the rest of us. In a better position to prioritize problems. Well, what's the first duty of the Commonwealth? The first duty of the Commonwealth is the defence of the nation. And look what they've done to defence. Look how they raided the defence budget for political advantage with that ridiculous contract to get French nuclear submarines, convert them into old-fashioned conventional submarines, and have them delivered so that the full fleet won't be here. We won't have the full submarine fleet, even by the centenary of the victory over Japan in 2045. We won't have the full submarine fleet in 2045. Do they seriously think that potential enemies are going to wait until 2045 if they wish to do something aggressively in relation to Australia? And why did they release the Brereton report? I don't know why they commissioned it in the first place, but why did they publish it, edited, but they still published it and said it contained brutal truths, and then took away the presumption of innocence? What they've done with that is taken away the morale of the Defence Forces, and they're ensuring that the sort of people who would volunteer to join the Defence Forces are having second thoughts. So look what they've done to the first priority of the nation, the defence of the nation. Fortunately, we seem to have the first real defence minister, Peter Dutton, for many years, the first real defence minister, and hopefully he will do something about this. But the government as a whole has failed significantly in relation to their first priority. So their belief that politicians are better in prioritising problems is obviously yet another myth. So those are the 10 myths which make me conclude that the politicians seem to have a plan to make us a backward and poorly educated country with educational standards far lower than those of comparative countries. This is a terrible fate for this country. Australians, it's time to take back your country.